The morning of my brother's wedding, I wore a dress I'd bought 6 months ago and never tried on again. Pale blue, fitted at the waist, the kind of thing you pick when you're still hopeful about a day you're not entirely sure you want to attend. I'd flown in from Denver the night before, taken a cab from the airport instead of calling anyone, and checked into a Holiday Inn 3 miles from the church because I needed one space in this entire weekend that was just mine. My brother Daniel was marrying a woman named Kristen. They'd been together 4 years. I'd met her 11 times I counted, because I'm the kind of person who counts things like that when something feels off but I can't name why. 11 times, and every single time, she smiled at me with her mouth but not her eyes, and called me the career girl like it was a compliment. Daniel was 34. I was 31. We'd grown up in the same house in Dayton, Ohio, shared a bathroom for 18 years, and somewhere between my leaving for college and his staying home to help our father run the hardware store, we'd become people who called each other on birthdays and not much else. I loved him the way you love a place you grew up in completely, and from a distance. The wedding was at 11. I arrived at 10:40 and sat in the third pew on the right side, which was apparently the wrong side, because a woman with a clipboard asked me to move. I moved. I sat behind a man in a too-tight suit jacket and spent the next 20 minutes reading the printed program twice and checking my phone once, which is when I saw the text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Don't react when you read this. I need to talk to you after the ceremony. I'm the one who did your father's accounting for 12 years. My name is Paul Whitmore. Please don't mention this to anyone." I read it 3 times. Then I looked up at the altar and watched my brother straighten his tie and smile at the groomsman next to him, and I put my phone face down on my thigh and sat very still for the rest of the ceremony. The thing about being the kind of person who counts things is that you also notice them. I noticed that when the officiant said in sickness and in health, Kristen looked not at my brother but at something slightly past his left shoulder. I noticed that my father, seated in the front pew, had lost weight since Christmas, not healthy weight, the other kind, the kind that happens quietly. I noticed that my mother kept touching his arm the way you touch someone you're afraid might disappear. I smiled through the kiss. I clapped. I followed the procession out into the October sunlight and stood near the rose bushes while people took photographs, and someone handed me a glass of champagne I didn't drink. A man in his mid-60s approached me from the left. Gray suit, sensible shoes, the kind of face that had probably always looked a little worried. He stopped 2 feet away and said quietly, "Thank you for not reacting." I said, "You have about 90 seconds before my mother comes to find me." He nodded and spoke fast. He said he'd been my father's accountant since before I was born. Said my father had called him 8 months ago, confused about a withdrawal, a large one, from a joint account my father hadn't known was joint. Said when Paul had looked into it, he'd found 3 accounts he hadn't set up, all tied to my father's social security number, all opened in the past 2 years. Said the signatures on the paperwork were not my father's. Said he had copies of everything, had been trying to figure out what to do, and that 3 weeks ago, my father had called him again, this time to say that Kristen had suggested he update his will before the wedding, that it was just paperwork, that Daniel had already signed his portion. Paul handed me a folded envelope. "I didn't know who else to bring this to," he said. "Daniel won't hear it. I've tried." My mother appeared at my elbow then, beautiful in her lilac dress, saying my name with a smile. Paul excused himself smoothly and walked toward the parking lot, and I slipped the envelope into my small clutch and hugged my mother and told her the ceremony was lovely. The reception was at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. Round tables with cream linens, a string quartet, a seating chart that put me at table 7 with cousins I saw once every 3 years and their assorted spouses. The food was good. I ate none of it. I excused myself after the salad course and went to the bathroom, locked the stall, and opened the envelope. Inside were 6 pages, printed copies of account statements, a signature comparison chart that Paul had apparently paid a handwriting analyst to produce, and a single handwritten note that said, "The will was amended 14 days ago. Your father does not have dementia, but Kristen has told the attorney that he does. I believe she has documentation to support this claim. I don't know how she got it." I stood in that bathroom stall for a long time. My father was 67 years old. He was sharper than me in most ways. Still did the store inventory by hand because he didn't trust spreadsheets. I still called me on Sunday mornings to talk about whatever documentary he'd watched the week before. He was not a man who forgot things. He was not a man who needed anyone to manage his affairs. But he had lost weight, and my mother kept touching his arm. I folded the pages back into the envelope. I smoothed my dress. I walked back out to table 7 and drank half a glass of wine and watched Kristen dance with my brother, her head on his shoulder, her eyes closed, smiling the smile that never quite reached the right place. That night, after the reception, I drove to my parents' house instead of the Holiday Inn. My mother answered the door in her robe, surprised, pleased. My father was still awake, watching television in his chair the way he always did. He stood up when he saw me and hugged me, and I held on a beat longer than usual, long enough that my mother raised her eyebrows when I let go. I sat with them for an hour. I didn't mention the envelope. I watched my father, and he was fine present, funny, finishing his sentences, remembering that I'd changed jobs 8 months ago and asking how the new position was going. Whatever story Kristen had built about him, it was not reflected in the man sitting across from me in that living room. Before I left, I hugged him again in the doorway and said quietly, "Dad, did you sign anything recently? For the will?" He looked at me. "Kristen said it was just an update. Daniel asked me to. Did you read it?" A pause. "Small, but there." "She said it was standard," he said. I drove back to the Holiday Inn and called Paul Whitmore from my room. It was 11:30. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. I asked him how Kristen could have gotten documentation claiming my father had dementia if he didn't have it. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said there was a clinic, a private one, out of state that had apparently issued a cognitive assessment report in my father's name 8 months ago. He'd found the reference in the will amendment paperwork. He didn't know how she'd gotten access to my father's medical information to initiate it. He didn't know if my father had ever actually been to that clinic. I asked how much money we were talking about. He told me. I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. The number was not catastrophic in the way that makes the news. It was catastrophic in the way that ruins people quietly retirement savings, the equity in the house, to a small investment account my father had built over 40 years of running a store that sold paint and screws and lumber to people building things with their hands. All of it directed, in the amended will, to a trust, the trustee of which was Kristen. Daniel was listed as a secondary beneficiary, but only after the trust. I stayed up until 3 in the morning making notes. Not emotional notes, practical ones. Names, dates, account numbers from Paul's copies, the name of the clinic. I was not in law enforcement. I was a project manager at a logistics company in Denver, but I knew how to build a timeline, and I knew how to find the next step, and I knew that the next step was not confronting Daniel at 10 the morning after his wedding. Over the following 3 weeks, I did things carefully. I found the clinic. It was a real facility, small, in Tennessee, that offered cognitive assessments. When I called and gave my father's name, the receptionist said they had no record of a patient by that name. When I asked if records could be requested under a different authorization, she said any records would require the patient's signature or a legal representative. I asked if a cognitive assessment could be ordered by a family member on behalf of a patient. She paused and said, not without the patient's knowledge and consent. So someone had submitted my father's information, his insurance, his social security number, his medical history, and produced a document that claimed he'd been assessed and found to have early-stage cognitive decline, and my father had never set foot in that clinic. I called an attorney in Dayton, not a family friend, a stranger, someone whose name I found by asking a colleague in Denver who had navigated a difficult estate situation the year before. I drove back to Dayton on a Friday, met with her on Saturday morning, and laid out everything on the conference table in her office. Her name was Ellen Park. She was 50, precise, the kind of person who took notes in a handwriting so small and neat it looked like a font. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the copies for a long moment. "The fraudulent medical document is the key," she said. "If we can prove that assessment was generated without your father's knowledge or consent, the will amendment is invalid. The accounts opened in his name without his authorization are a separate matter, potentially criminal." I asked about Daniel. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who is about to say something you will not like. "It's possible he doesn't know," she said. "It's also possible he does. Right now, we don't touch that question. We build the case around what we can prove." I drove to my parents' house from her office. I sat at the kitchen table with my father and told him, without showing him the documents, that I had some concerns about the will update and that I wanted him to speak with an attorney before anything was finalized. I kept my voice even. I told him I loved him. I told him I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "She said you'd do this." The air in the kitchen changed. I asked him what he meant. He said Kristen had told him, before the wedding, that I had always resented not being included in the family business, that I might try to interfere with estate planning out of jealousy. He said he hadn't believed it, but he said it with a heaviness that told me it had planted itself somewhere. I went back to Denver that Sunday. I called Ellen Park every few days. I did not call Daniel. 6 weeks after the wedding, Ellen called me at 7 in the morning. She had filed a request with the Tennessee Clinic for any records related to my father's name submitted through the correct legal channels, with authorization my father had signed in her office the week before. The clinic had responded within 48 hours. They had no record, no visit, no assessment, no file. Ellen had also contacted the state's financial crimes unit. The forged medical document, combined with the unauthorized account openings, was enough to open an investigation. The investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Torres. She called me 2 days after the investigation opened and asked me to walk her through the timeline. I did. She asked if I had physical copies of everything. I said yes. She asked if my father was willing to cooperate. I said I would ask. I drove back to Dayton. This time, I brought the documents. My father sat at that kitchen table and looked at the account statements, the accounts he hadn't opened, the withdrawals he hadn't made, and something in his face changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not grief exactly, something older than grief, the look of a person who has understood something they wish they hadn't. My mother asked me to stop twice, not because she didn't believe me, because it hurt. I kept going, gently, but I kept going. My father called Ellen Park that afternoon and agreed to cooperate fully. Over the next 2 months, the investigation expanded. Detective Torres found that the fraudulent medical records had been generated using a template purchased through a private document service, the kind of service that exists in legal gray areas and markets itself to caregivers and estate planners. The purchase had been made from an email address that was traced, eventually, to a device registered in Kristen's name. The account openings were linked to a notary in Cincinnati who, when questioned, said he had notarized documents presented to him by a woman matching Kristen's description and a man he identified from a photograph as my brother. Daniel was brought in for questioning on a Tuesday in February. I know this because my mother called me that evening, crying, not because she was angry at me, but because she didn't know what else to do. I drove to Dayton again. I sat with her in the living room while my father was quiet in his chair, the television off for once. We didn't talk about what was going to happen. We just sat. Daniel cooperated with investigators. His attorney negotiated the terms. He maintained, and investigators ultimately found credible, that he had not understood the full scope of what Kristen had constructed, that he had signed documents she had described to him in general terms, that he had believed the medical assessment was real, that he had not known about the unauthorized accounts. Whether you believe that depends on what you think love makes people capable of not seeing. Kristen did not cooperate. Her trial began on a gray Wednesday in April, 14 months after the wedding, where I'd worn the pale blue dress and sat in the wrong pew and received a text from a man in a gray suit who had been worried about my father for longer than I'd known to be. I testified. I sat in the witness box and answered questions carefully and looked at Kristen across the courtroom, and she looked back at me with an expression that was almost curious, like she was still trying to figure out where it had gone wrong. Ellen Park sat in the gallery for the verdict. The jury found Kristen guilty on 3 counts: financial elder abuse, identity fraud, and forgery. The judge sentenced her to 9 years. The fraudulently amended will was voided. The accounts were closed, and recovery proceedings were initiated for the transferred funds. Not all of it would come back, but most of it would. Daniel did not attend the sentencing. I don't know exactly what that means. I think he loved her. I think some part of him still does, which is its own kind of sentence. After the verdict, I walked out of the courthouse into afternoon light that was warmer than the season had any right to produce. My father was next to me. He didn't say much. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment the way he used to when I was small and had done something he was proud of, and then he let go. My mother took his arm. I looked at the two of them, standing there in the April sun, looking like what they were, two people who had been married for 38 years and had, against considerable effort to the contrary, made it to another ordinary afternoon. There is no clean ending to a story like this. The hardware store is still there. My father still does the inventory by hand. I still fly in for holidays and stay at a hotel because I need one space that is just mine, though now it's habit more than necessity. Daniel and I have spoken twice since the sentencing short calls, careful ones, the kind where you're both trying to figure out if there's still something on the other side of everything that happened. I think there might be. I'm not sure yet. Paul Whitmore retired last year. I sent him a card. He sent one back with a note that said simply, "Your father is a good man. I'm glad someone was paying attention." I kept that card. I put it in a drawer in my apartment in Denver, next to 11 years of birthday cards from a brother I'm still learning how to know again, and a photograph of my parents at a Sunday dinner 2 summers ago, laughing at something off camera, unaware they were being photographed, completely themselves. I look at that photograph sometimes when I'm trying to remember what we were protecting. It always works.